The U.S. elite and the U.S. masses. The making of a Constitution. Now that we've spoken about the people of the time, it's important to give us a little bit of a historical background as to what was going on at this time period. It's not my intention here to really bring you back through all of American history, just to pick out a couple of the highlights so that we can understand where we were in terms of the formation of government during this historical time period. So let's talk about the events surrounding the American Revolution. We pretty much know off the top of our heads that the Declaration of Independence was finished by Thomas Jefferson on July 4th, 1776, and we may know somewhere in there that the American Revolutionary War began a year before in 1775. And so let's talk about kind of different things that were happening and overlapping each other during this time. In 1774, we had the First Continental Congress. This was the first time where we had representatives of the different states coming together to try to decide to work out some form of governmental agreement that was going to work between all of them. The year after that, 1775, we had the British are coming, Paul Revere's famous ride in April, and the states began making their own constitutions, their own state constitutions, to govern themselves. Also in 1775, we had the Second Continental Congress. This convened on May 10th. This was in the middle of the war. And the states' representatives who came together began debate on something which was going to be called the Articles of Confederation. In 1776, we had the Declaration of Independence, which was finished on July 4th. And then we had the delegates coming to sign on August 2nd. And then in 1781, the Articles of Confederation are adopted, followed by the end of the war with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So why do I pick out these few things? I want to point out a couple of different things. First off, as you can see, we have a couple of different things overlapping each other here, which seem like they would be quite big events in and of themselves. We have the Continental Congresses coming together to create this thing called the Articles of Confederation, which looked like it took between 1774 to 1781. We also had the Declaration of Independence, which was in 1776, and we also had, the American Revolutionary War going on at the same time. And so it's interesting to think about the players who were involved in each of these scenarios. First off, it's important to think about what was going on with technology at that time. We had no phones, we had no cars or planes or email or anything like that. And so we actually had to communicate in ways that took a very, very long time. If you wanted to invite someone to a Continental Congress, this took letters going back and forth by foot or horse, and it would take some time to get from one state to another. And so if you were going to come together for something like a Continental Congress, which was going to be a meeting, this wasn't an instance of, I'm just going to fly down to LA for a weekend and attend a conference and then come right back up. You really had to plan to be away for quite some time. And because of that, because it would take, weeks to a month to get from New York down to Virginia, for example, you wanted to make sure that when you got there, the meeting that you were there for was well worth it. So oftentimes these Continental Congresses would drag on and go for a month or two at a time. So this wasn't an instance where they would come together and hammer something out in a day or a week and then leave. These Congresses were debates and working sessions which would go on for months on end. And so you had to think about the people who had the availability and the money not only to make those trips, but to take off from the work that they had to go down. I don't know about you, but my boss wouldn't be too happy if I decided to disappear for a couple of months to attend a constitutional convention. And let alone if you were a subsistence farmer and you actually had to farm in order to survive and have your family survive, you really weren't going to be able to take off from your farm in order to concentrate on ideas of government and debates of this sort. So the people who were engaged in these processes were had the means to do so. They had the time and the money to be able to be away and to devote their time to other things like this. The Declaration of Independence, we're looking at very much the same group of people who were there for the Continental Congress coming together for the Declaration of Independence. There's a lot of overlap in terms of the individuals who were involved in all of these different types of gatherings for government. And so, in the middle of the Continental Congress, they had to begin debates on Articles of Confederation, work on that, and then some of them had to take a break and then go meet elsewhere and work on the Declaration of Independence, and then go as delegates to begin to sign that. So really, we're talking about a governmental process of debate and really hammering out these documents, which was going to last a couple of years. That being said, another thing that lasted a couple of years during this time was the American Revolutionary War. So clearly, we don't have an instance where the people who are in these rooms making these decisions and holding debates were on the front lines of war. While they were discussing governments and debating politics, there was a war raging on outside, which clearly they weren't on the front lines of. So let's talk a little bit about the Articles of Confederation, which really was our first constitution. You probably didn't think before today that there were multiple constitutions, but there were actually two. The one which we know of today is the Constitution, and our first Constitution, which is the Articles of Confederation. All a constitution is a system of fundamental principles according to which a nation, state, corporation, or the like is governed. So you can think about the Articles of Incorporation, for example, of a business as their own constitution. This talks about what fundamental principles we're actually going to follow in the governance of this corporation. That's exactly the same thing, and that's what we were looking at in the Articles of Confederation. This is what it looked like, and we really put this together to establish a firm league of friendship. There was no desire at this time to create an umbrella government over the states, but really just create a way for us to work together. If you think about it, at the time, each of the states had their own little governments, their own little constitutions, their own money. And so if you were to go between, Connecticut and New Jersey, Connecticut had its own money and New Jersey had its own money. So how were you going to figure out how much of one currency equaled another? So this was a little bit of a problem. We wanted to make sure that with the Articles of Confederation, we could do certain things. And they generally fell into two categories. One that had to do with foreign affairs and one that had to do with really economics. First off, they needed to be able to declare war, receive ambassadors, and make treaties. So there was really no way to do that at the time, and there was no way of saying, well, I, Virginia, want to make war against this other country, and getting the buy-in from the states or the support of states around them. And so they wanted to actually have a way that they could discuss these things together. They also wanted to fix weights and measures, regulate the value of money, manage Indian affairs, and borrow money. Remember, you have a very brand new group of states, and so they need a lot of capital in order to fix themselves up and get started as new governments, and so they needed to figure out a way that they could do this between the lot of them. They also needed to do something like fix weights and measures. How much was a bushel worth? We take for granted that you can kind of go around the country and everybody might know what an inch is or how much a cup is of a certain thing. Well, they didn't have those back then. And so there was no way when you were trading to regulate these weights and measures. So they wanted to speak about that as well. You'll notice a couple of important missing powers. There was no executive. We didn't come up with a president. We didn't come up with any way to have somebody to rule over all of the different states. And we didn't talk about any power to regulate commerce. We didn't want any watchdog looking over us to talk about how we could trade between the states and who was going to regulate that. There was also no power to tax at the federal level. This created a problem because there was a lot of money which was borrowed in order to finance the war. And there was no way to pay it back because you couldn't tax people at the federal level. All of the taxes went just to the states, and the states weren't about to pony up that money in order to pay back a national debt. Action required the assent of at least 9 states, and so if they wanted to do anything, this really depended heavily on cooperation. If you'll remember, there were 13 states at the time, so you really had to get quite a large supermajority if you were going to do anything, if you were actually going to have anything take place. So why was a document like this created? It seems quite different from the one that we know of today. So let's talk a little bit about what was going on so that we can understand the background for why we had these rules that were put in place. Well, first off, we just got out of a bad relationship with the British monarchy. Right when you break away from a king, there's really no compulsion to jump into a situation where we have another king in this place. We didn't want to replace King of Britain with King of America. Hence, no executive branch. We didn't want that at all. Secondly, we had 13 different states with their own ways of doing things. Like I said, they had their own money, they had their own governments, they had their own systems of trades and weights and measures, and really everybody was happy with their own little system, and they didn't want to be influenced by another system which they believed not to really work with one that they had. Thirdly, they definitely wanted to preserve the states' rights, hence this 9-state requirement. They wanted to be in a situation where they could work together, but no one was going to infringe upon their right to do as they would and create rules for their own particular system. They were very afraid that someone was going to come in and instead of British conquering them, it would be an American army conquering them, and there would be a system of rules and uniformity in place which they didn't agree with after they had worked so hard to set up their own separate little governments. The political party at the time, known as the Anti-Federalists, was very strong about states' rights. And we'll be talking about federalism in maybe next week or this following week, as a system where you had a national government paired with this system of state governments. Well, there was the Anti-Federalist Party, which didn't want a national government at all. They didn't want anything over them. They really wanted to make sure that the states had their own rights and they were preserved, and that nobody was telling the states what to do.